I was born in a military family. My father was a high-ranking officer of the Soviet Army General Staff, inspector of land forces, stationed outside of USSR in every quote-unquote brotherly country or liberated country of the world. I graduated from Oriental Studies Institute, affiliated to Moscow State University in 1963. I started working with Novosti press agency, the biggest propaganda and ideological subversion organization of USSR, which is directly under KGB. Ostensibly, it's a public news agency. Novosti in Russian language means news, but there are no news. It's mainly propaganda. My first job was a translator with Economical Aid Group in India. We were building refineries and other industrial projects in public sector, socialist sector of India. My last job was press officer of the Soviet Embassy in New Delhi. I defected in 1970, landed in Canada, worked for several years as a producer of Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, overseas service in Russian language, similar to Voice of America. Then I was teaching at University of Toronto, Political Science Department, McGill University, Slavic Studies, and School of Journalism, Ottawa, in Carleton University in Ottawa. Last year I joined a small Russian language publishing house here in Los Angeles, and now I'm a political analyst for weekly Panorama newspaper. Lumumba University language instruction was my so-called extracurricular activity, which is usually given to Soviet young communists as a non-paid job to prove loyalty to the party. I was instructing students from Asia, Latin America, and Africa before they entered an ideological indoctrination class. It was mainly Russian language instruction, after which the students usually joined 2-year or 3-year extensive course in Marxist-Leninist ideological indoctrination, plus their own subjects of their choice, medicine, physics, chemistry, whatever. If after 5 or 6 years studying they are proven to be, well, flexible, loyal, cynical enough to follow the Soviet foreign policy, they are being transferred to a KGB school for a period of 2 years, after which they are being dispatched back to their native countries and become so-called sleepers. The word originated from sleeping. For several years they sleep in their own countries doing nothing. Sometimes they're pursuing their own careers. They become lawyers, doctors, teachers, taxi drivers, barbers. And they spring into action after many years of destabilization of their own countries as Soviet agents. Therefore, all of a sudden you discover well-established lawyers in a country like Nicaragua who are, for some strange reason, are bitterly against quote-unquote American imperialism and idealistically for Soviet Marxist-Leninist imperialism. I joined Novosti Press Agency before I graduated from the Oriental Studies Institute, where I studied Hindi and Urdu, 2 languages of Indian subcontinent. Urdu is the language of Pakistan and Hindi is the language of India. The journalistic part of my training was ordinary journalism, mass media, communication theories and studies. Together with that, we had a very extensive training in military, civil defense, intelligence, and ideological subversion. So even before I graduated, I started working with Novosti Press Agency, first as a translator, interpreter, and guide with foreign delegations who were invited to USSR and who were shown all the beauties of socialism and dispatched back to their countries to explain to their people how beautiful is socialism. My role was directly linked with KGB activities of brainwashing and psychological assessment of these guests. If they showed any sign of flexibility, which means they showed that they were recruitable, I passed them over to professional KGB recruiters, and from there on they were actively being involved in ideological subversion and propaganda, both in USSR and in their own countries. Well, decision, of course, was very painful and difficult. But on the other hand, I didn't have any illusions or allusions about the Soviet system and communist or socialist system. It's the most rotten and unworking system in the world. Some people call it state capitalism, socialism, centralized planning, whatever. It doesn't really matter what kind of name you attach to the system. Basically, if you're a religious person, it's a devilish, satanistic system which appeals only to the most primitive, negative side of human nature. The basis of that system is denial of private property, human dignity, and personal responsibility, and of course any religious affiliation of a human being to God as a supreme being. My dissatisfaction, disillusionment, if you can call it, because I never was illusioned with the communism, started as early as from age 6, I guess. The first shock was after the Second World War, when most of the children of my age understood that United States is the friend with whom together Soviet people defeated Nazism, German fascism, all of a sudden turned into an enemy, and all of a sudden the propaganda turned 180 degrees around, and we were brainwashed in the spirit of hatred to everything which is American. But how could you explain to a child of 6 years old who owes his survival to American spam, condensed milk, egg powder, and things which you probably people never remember because nobody eats them these days, spam meat, you know what I'm talking about? How can you explain to them that these delicious things came from an enemy who wants to subvert and destroy us? It's impossible, because the child remembers when he was hungry, he was eating spam and drinking condensed American milk with the American eagle on the label. So all the efforts of the Soviet propaganda to convince me that America is bad was futile, naturally. That was the first shock. The second was this 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, when Khrushchev revealed the atrocities of Stalin, terrorism, and murder, systematic murder of millions of innocent people. That was another greatest shock. And the third shock, of course, when I was already grown up, a student, invasion into Czechoslovakia in 1968. That was the last point. And when I was in India, acting as a Soviet official, a Soviet diplomat, I understood that sooner or later I have to defect and to explain what exactly I was doing in India. I fell in love with that country because at that time this country didn't do any harm to any neighbors, least of all to the Soviet Union. And yet we did so much harm to that country that I decided to defect and explain it, first to Indians, then to American politicians, intelligence communities, and media. Unfortunately, I didn't have much success because my stories were treated with a great skepticism. I was called paranoid, McCarthyist, fascist, Cold War maniac, and other names which I don't want to mention here. And it took me quite a number of years to understand that I'm talking to people who are trying to prevent average American from knowing the truth about communism.